Dance, someone said with a laugh. Let's see if a broken Omega even knows how. The wine hit the marble first, then her shoes, dark red spreading like a stain she couldn't outrun, and the laughter followed a heartbeat later. Light, careless, practiced, echoing beneath the vaulted ceilings of Blackwood Palace, as if humiliation itself had a rhythm. Elena Whitmore didn't look up. She never did. Not when the nobles whispered, not when they stared, not when they pretended she wasn't there until it amused them that she was, because invisibility was safer than hope, and she had learned that lesson long before tonight, long before the silk and gold and chandeliers that burned too bright for someone dressed in mended cloth and quiet apologies. Her fingers tightened around the silver tray, knuckles pale, the thin fabric at her sleeves still damp where the wine had soaked through, clinging cold against her skin as she stepped carefully around the spreading stain, careful not to slip, careful not to draw more attention, careful in all the ways that kept her small. Watch your step, servant, one of the young ladies murmured with a smile too sharp to be kind, and Elena nodded, always nodding, always lowering her gaze as if the floor might open and swallow her whole if she dared to meet theirs. Somewhere beyond the laughter, music faltered, the violins stretching thin before falling silent, and for a moment the room held its breath, but not for her, never for her, only for the expectation that something better, someone worth noticing, might step into the light. She moved to kneel, setting the tray aside, reaching for a cloth to wipe the marble clean because even her shame had rules, because even her presence required correction, and as she pressed the fabric against the floor, she caught a flicker of her reflection in the polished stone, dim, distorted, barely there, and something inside her chest tightened, not pain, not quite, but the echo of something she used to believe in before the world taught her otherwise. Faster, the overseer hissed from behind her, voice low but cutting, and she obeyed, because obedience was easier than being seen, easier than being chosen and then discarded, easier than remembering the night she stood where the music played and no one stepped forward, no one claimed her, no one saw her. The laughter shifted again, louder now, closer, circling, and Elena felt it before she heard it. The weight of attention pressing down, dragging her upward without a hand ever touching her, until she realized the room had turned, the crowd parting not for her, but around her, leaving her exposed in the center of polished stone and golden light. Get up, the overseer said, not unkindly but not gently either, and when she hesitated, just for a second, just long enough to feel every eye on her, he added, you're entertaining tonight. The words landed heavier than the wine, heavier than the laughter, and Elena rose slowly, heart beating too loud in her ears, her breath shallow as she stood where she was never meant to stand, where silk brushed past her and whispers and jewels caught the light like stars she could never reach. The silence stretched, thin and waiting, and for a moment she thought of refusing, of stepping back into shadow where she belonged, but her feet didn't move, her voice didn't come, and all she could do was stand there, small and still, as the room watched, as the world held her in place, as if something unseen had already decided this was the moment everything would change. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and trembling, as if the entire hall was waiting for her to fail in a way that would be entertaining enough to remember, and Elena felt it in her chest, a tight, hollow pressure that made it hard to breathe as she stood frozen beneath the chandeliers, the light too bright, the air too warm, every whisper brushing against her skin like a reminder that she did not belong here, not in the center, not under their gaze, not in a moment that demanded something she had never been allowed to become. Her hands hung at her sides, empty now, no tray to hold, no task to hide behind, and for a second she almost lifted them, almost tried to follow the rhythm that had not yet returned, but her body refused, locked in the quiet certainty that anything she did would only make them laugh louder. A soft chuckle rippled through the crowd, then another, until the sound grew, curling around her like smoke, and someone near the front tilted their head with a smirk, saying, "Is she going to stand there all night?" And the words landed heavier than they should have, because they were true, because standing still was the only thing she knew how to do when the world turned its eyes on her. Elena swallowed, her throat dry, her gaze fixed just above the polished floor, and she told herself to move. Just one step, just enough to end this, to give them something small so they would let her disappear again. But her feet would not obey, as if the marble beneath her had turned to glass and she might shatter it with the wrong motion. The overseer shifted behind her, impatience sharp in the air, and she felt the expectation building, pressing, waiting for the moment she would break under it. And in that fragile space her thoughts flickered, not to the room, not to the laughter, but to a quieter memory, to the way her mother used to hum in the kitchen, a soft, steady rhythm that made even the smallest steps feel safe. And for a heartbeat Elena held on to that sound, held on to the idea that movement did not have to be perfect, that it could simply exist. Her fingers curled slightly, a breath caught in her lungs, and she began to lift her foot, slow, uncertain. The beginning of something so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the way the room leaned in, watching, waiting, ready to turn it into another joke. And just as her heel left the floor, just as the moment balanced on the edge of becoming, something shifted at the far end of the hall, not loud, not sudden, but undeniable, like a change in gravity that pulled every instinct toward it at once. The murmurs faltered, the laughter thinned, and a quiet spread outward in a wave that no one commanded but everyone obeyed. And Elena felt it before she understood it, a presence that did not demand attention yet claimed it entirely, drawing every gaze away from her and toward the grand entrance where the doors stood open and the night air slipped inside, cool and steady against the warmth of the hall. She did not look up. Right away, she could not. Her breath still caught, her body still caught between movement and stillness. But she felt the shift, the way the room straightened, the way the space itself seemed to hold its shape differently, as if something powerful had stepped into it and everything else adjusted without question. And when she finally lifted her eyes, just a fraction, just enough to see past the edge of the crowd, she caught a glimpse of dark fabric, of a figure standing where the light met. Shadow, and something in her chest tightened again, not from fear this time, but from a strange, unfamiliar awareness that the moment had changed in a way she could not yet understand. The figure did not move at first, and yet everything else did. The crowd parting without being told, voices lowering into a silence that felt almost reverent, as if the very air understood who had entered before the people did. And Elena felt it ripple through her like a quiet command she had never learned but somehow obeyed, her body going still again, her breath shallow as her eyes lifted just enough to see him more clearly now. Not fully, not boldly, but in fragments, a dark coat falling, clean and sharp to his boots, shoulders straight with a kind of effortless authority that did not need to announce itself. And then his face, carved in shadow and light, his expression unreadable, calm in a way that made the entire room feel suddenly too loud even in silence. King Adrian Blackwood did not rush, did not glance around for approval, did not acknowledge the nobles who bowed their heads or stepped back to clear his path. He simply walked forward, each step measured, steady, the sound of his boots against marble the only thing breaking the stillness. And Elena realized with a quiet jolt that he was not looking at the chandeliers or the dancers or the highborn ladies waiting with perfect smiles. He was looking ahead, focused, as if something had already drawn his attention long before he entered the room. Her heart stuttered, a sudden, unfamiliar rhythm, and she lowered her gaze instinctively, telling herself it could not be her. It was never her. It would never be her. And yet something in the air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like a thread tightening between two unseen points, pulling, guiding, narrowing the distance one step at a time. The nobles nearest to her shifted uneasily, their confidence thinning under that quiet, steady presence. And someone near her whispered, "Why is he coming this way?" But no one answered, because no one understood, because kings did not cross the room for servants, did not pause for those who did not matter, did not change the rhythm of a night, built around power and selection for someone dressed in worn fabric and silence. Elena felt her pulse in her fingertips, in her throat, in the hollow space beneath her ribs, and she told herself to step back, to move aside before she blocked his path, before she made a mistake that would cost her what little place she had left. But her feet refused again, rooted not in fear this time, but in something deeper, something that felt almost like recognition without memory, as if her body knew. Something her mind could not yet reach. The distance between them closed, 5 steps, 4, 3, and still he did not look away, did not falter, and when he finally stopped, it was directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint glint of silver in his eyes, not cold, not cruel, but sharp, aware, as if he saw more than what stood before him, and the silence deepened, pressing against her ears until it felt like the entire hall was holding its breath for what he would do. Next, Elena kept her gaze lowered, her hands trembling at her sides, waiting for an order, a dismissal, anything that would return the world to something she understood, but instead there was only a pause, a heartbeat that stretched longer than it should have, and then the slightest shift of movement as he extended his hand toward her, palm open, steady, offering rather than commanding, and his voice, when it came, was low and clear, carrying effortlessly through the silence. "Will you dance with me?" And for a moment Elena thought she had imagined it, thought the words could not possibly belong to her, could not possibly be meant for someone like her, but the hand remained, unwavering, and every eye in. The room turned fully toward her now, not with laughter this time, but with something else, something sharper, something uncertain, as the night waited for her answer. For a moment, no one moved, not the nobles, not the musicians, not even the servants along the edges of the hall, as if the world itself had paused to witness something it did not quite understand, and Elena stood there with her breath caught in her chest, her eyes fixed on his outstretched hand as though it belonged to another reality, one she had never been meant to touch. Her first instinct was to refuse, not out of defiance, but out of certainty, the kind that had been carved into her over years of being overlooked and dismissed, the quiet belief that this could not be meant for her, that there must be some mistake, that if she reached for him the illusion would break and the laughter would return louder than before. "My king," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, careful, respectful, trying to step back without appearing to flee. "I am only a servant." And the words felt small even as she said them, like something rehearsed too many times to ever sound different. But he did not withdraw his hand, did not correct her, did not look past her to someone more suitable. Instead, he held his position with a calm patience that did not pressure but did not waver either, his gaze steady on her, as if he had already made his choice and was simply waiting for her to see it. The silence stretched again, but it had changed now, no longer expectant in a cruel way but tense with disbelief. The nobles watching closely, some with narrowed eyes, others with faint, uncertain smiles that did not quite hide their confusion, and Elena felt all of it pressing in, the weight of their attention heavier than before, because it was no longer dismissive, it was questioning. Her fingers trembled at her sides, and she became acutely aware of everything at once, the faint chill where the wine had dried on her dress, the soft flicker of candlelight across the polished floor, the steady presence of the man in front of her who did not seem to belong to the same fragile balance as the rest of them, and somewhere beneath all of it, something quieter stirred, a feeling she could not name, not hope exactly, not yet, but something that refused to let her step away. She lifted her gaze a little more, enough to meet his eyes fully for the first time, and the world seemed to narrow in that instant, the noise fading, the room blurring at the edges, until there was only that look, calm and certain and impossibly focused on her, as if he saw not the worn fabric or the lowered status or the years of being unseen, but something else entirely, something she had long forgotten how to recognize. Her breath hitched softly, and without quite deciding to, without fully understanding why, she began to raise her hand, slow and hesitant, as though the distance between them was greater than a few inches, as though crossing it meant stepping into a life she had never been allowed to imagine. A faint murmur rippled through the crowd as her fingers hovered just above his, the moment stretching thin and fragile, and then her hand touched his, light at first, uncertain, but the contact was real, warm, grounding, and something shifted the instant it happened, not in the room, not in the watching eyes, but within her, a quiet spark that spread outward, steady and undeniable, as if a door had opened somewhere deep inside where nothing had stirred in a very long time. His fingers closed gently around hers, firm but not forceful, and the steadiness of his grip anchored her in a way she had not expected, pulling her forward just enough to guide her into the space beside him. And still no one spoke, No one interrupted, because there was something about the moment that did not allow it, something that felt larger than the rules they all understood. Elena felt her heart begin to race again. But it was different now, no longer trapped between fear and humiliation, but moving towards something unknown, something that felt almost like standing at the edge of a story she had never believed she could be part of. And as he stepped closer, as the space between them closed in a way that drew every gaze tighter, the first soft note of music returned, hesitant at first, then stronger, as if even the musicians needed a moment to believe what they were seeing, and the night, which had once been so certain in its order, began to shift into something entirely new. The music did not rush back into the room. It returned carefully, as if it too was uncertain of its place in this new reality. A single violin at first, soft and hesitant, then another, until the melody gathered itself into something steady enough to hold the moment, and Elena felt it beneath her feet, a rhythm she had not followed in years, one she had only ever practiced in quiet corners where no one could see her fail. King Adrian did not pull her abruptly, did not force her into motion. Instead, he stepped with a subtle guidance, a quiet shift of weight that invited rather than commanded, and her body responded before her thoughts could catch up, her feet moving in small, careful steps that mirrored his, her breath uneven but steadying with each passing second. The room watched, she could feel it, every gaze tracing their movement across the polished floor, but the laughter did not return, the whispers did not rise, and that absence was louder than any sound she had known before, because it meant something had changed in a way no one could easily undo. Her hand remained in his, still warm, still steady, and the contact anchored her as the distance between each step shortened, as the rhythm settled into something she could follow without fear of falling behind. She kept her eyes lowered at first, out of habit more than intention, focusing on the precise placement of her feet, the smooth glide of marble beneath worn soles, the careful turn of her body as he guided her through a simple pattern that felt both unfamiliar and strangely natural, as if her body remembered what her mind had long forgotten. "Look at me," he said quietly, not a command but a request that carried more weight than any order she had ever obeyed. And for a heartbeat she hesitated, the old instinct rising again, the fear of being seen, of being judged, of confirming everything they had ever believed about her. But something in his tone held steady, patient, certain, and slowly, almost reluctantly, she lifted her gaze. The world shifted again in that instant, the room fading at the edges as her focus narrowed to the man in front of her, to the calm intensity in his eyes that did not waver, did not question, did not search for flaws. And she felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, not overwhelming, not consuming, but steady, like a quiet flame that refused to be extinguished. Her steps grew more confident without her noticing, the hesitation easing as she followed the rhythm, as she allowed herself to trust the guidance of his movements, and the dance, which had begun as something forced and fragile, began to take shape into something fluid, something real. Around them, the nobles remained still, their silence no longer filled with expectation of failure, but with something closer to disbelief, as if they were witnessing a story unfold that did not match the rules they had always known. Elena felt it in the way the space seemed to open around them, in the way no one stepped forward to interrupt, no one dared to laugh, because the moment had grown beyond them, beyond the simple cruelty that had defined it before. And as the music swelled, as the rhythm carried them through another turn, another step, she realized something she had never allowed herself to believe, not fully, not until now, that she was not merely surviving this moment, she was part of it, moving within it, seen in a way that could not be undone. And though she did not yet understand why he had chosen her, though the answer remained just out of reach, she felt the certainty of it in the steadiness of his hand, in the quiet focus of his gaze, in the undeniable truth that for the first time, she was no longer invisible. The rhythm settled into something deeper now, no longer hesitant, no longer fragile, but steady and undeniable, carrying them across the floor with a quiet confidence that did not need to be announced. And Elena felt it in every step, in the way her body responded without resistance, in the way her breath began to match the rise and fall of the music as if it had always known this pattern, and simply needed to remember. King Adrian's hand remained firm at hers, his other resting lightly at her side, guiding, without pressure, allowing her movement to exist within his rather than beneath it. And there was something in that balance that shifted the way she understood the moment, something that told her she was not being displayed, not being tested, but truly being seen. Her gaze no longer dropped as quickly now, no longer fled from his, and with each passing second she found it easier to meet his eyes, to hold that connection for longer than a heartbeat without the instinct to disappear, taking over. And in that space she began to notice things she had not allowed herself to before. The subtle warmth in his expression, the quiet focus that never wavered, the sense that he was not simply dancing but listening, as if every movement she made mattered. The room, once so overwhelming, began to fade further into the background, its presence reduced to a distant awareness of stillness and watchful silence. And Elena realized that no one had spoken, no one had interrupted, because something about this moment held them all in place. Something that made even the most powerful among them hesitate. She turned with him, the fabric of her worn dress brushing softly against the polished floor, and for the first time, she did not feel the weight of its imperfections, did not feel the sting of comparison against the silk and satin surrounding her, because his attention had never shifted away, had never measured her against anyone else. And that alone altered everything. "You were trying to leave," he said quietly, his voice low enough that it belonged only to them. And the words startled her, not because they were accusatory, but because they were true in a way she had not spoken aloud, and she hesitated before answering, her voice softer than she intended. "I did not think I was meant to stay." And even as she said it, she realized how deeply that belief had rooted itself within her, how naturally it had shaped every choice she made. His gaze did not harden, did not dismiss her. Instead, it held a kind of understanding that unsettled her more than any judgment could have, and he replied, just as quietly, "You were always meant to be here," and the certainty in his tone left no room for doubt, no space for the old narratives she had carried for so long. Elena felt something shift again at those words, something deeper than the music, deeper than the attention of the room, a quiet unraveling of the certainty that had once defined her place in the world. And for a moment she did not know how to respond, did not know how to accept something so different from everything she had been taught to believe. Her steps faltered just slightly, not enough to break the rhythm, but enough for him to notice. And his hand steadied her without drawing attention, a subtle reassurance that allowed her to continue without fear of failure. And she realized then that this dance was not about perfection, not about performance, but about presence, about the simple act of existing without shrinking. The music swelled again, fuller now, richer, and as they moved through another turn, Elena felt the weight of the room return in a different way, not as pressure, not as judgment, but as awareness. The undeniable recognition that every eye remained fixed on them, not out of mockery, but because something had shifted beyond expectation, something that could not easily be explained. And as she met his gaze once more, steadier now, more certain than before, she felt it clearly for the first time, not just the warmth, not just the connection, but the quiet, undeniable pull of something larger than the moment itself, something that whispered beneath the surface of every step that this was not an accident, not a mistake, but the beginning of something that had been waiting far longer than she could understand. The pull grew stronger with every step, no longer something she could dismiss as imagination or momentary illusion, but a quiet force that settled into her bones, steady and undeniable. And Elena felt it in the way her breath aligned with his, in the way her movements seemed to anticipate his without conscious thought, as if some deeper instinct had awakened beneath the surface of everything she had known. The music swelled again, fuller now, wrapping around them like a current, and as he guided her into another turn, something shifted inside her chest, a warmth that spread outward in a slow, steady bloom, not overwhelming, not frightening, but impossible to ignore, and she faltered just enough to notice it, just enough for her gaze to lift again in question. King Adrian saw it immediately, the subtle change, the flicker of uncertainty in her expression, and his hand tightened slightly around hers, not in restraint but in reassurance, grounding her in the moment as his voice lowered once more, meant only for her to hear. "Do you feel that?" And it was not a question of doubt, but of confirmation, as if he already knew the answer and only needed her to recognize it. Elena hesitated, her thoughts scattering as she tried to understand what was happening, because she had never felt anything like this before, never experienced a connection that did not come with fear or expectation or quiet dismissal. And yet this was different. This was something that reached beyond the surface, something that felt both unfamiliar and deeply known at the same time. And she found herself nodding before she could stop herself, her voice soft but certain when it came. Yes. And the words seemed to settle between them like a truth that could not be taken back. The air around them shifted again, subtle but undeniable, and though the room remained silent, Elena could sense the change in the others, the way their attention sharpened, the way their stillness grew more rigid, as if they too felt something they could not fully understand, something that did not belong to the usual patterns of power and selection. King Adrian's gaze did not leave hers, and for the first time there was something new within it, something deeper than calm certainty, something that carried a quiet intensity that made her breath catch, not out of fear, but out of the realization that this moment meant more than she had ever imagined. "It is rare," he said softly, his voice steady despite the weight of his words, "to find what was meant for you when you are not looking for it." And Elena felt those words settle into her, felt the truth of them resonate with something she had buried long ago, something that had once believed in belonging before it was taught to disappear. Her steps no longer faltered now, no longer hesitated, because the uncertainty that had once defined her movements had begun to unravel, replaced by something quieter but stronger, a growing understanding that this was not a mistake, not a moment of misplaced attention that would vanish when the music ended, but something real, something that had already begun to change the course of everything. Around them, the silence held, but it was no longer empty, no longer filled with expectation of failure. It was heavy with realization, with the dawning awareness that what they were witnessing could not be undone by laughter or dismissal, because it had already taken root in a way that defied the rules they had always relied on. Elena felt it in the way the space seemed to shift around them, in the way no one dared to interrupt, in the way even the most confident among them remained still, watching as the distance between what had been and what was now continued to widen, and as the music carried them forward, as each step deepened the connection she could no longer deny. Elena realized that the moment she had once feared had transformed into something else entirely, something that did not ask her to shrink or disappear, but to remain, to be seen, and perhaps, for the first time, to be chosen in a way that would not fade when the night was over. The realization did not arrive like a sudden revelation. It unfolded slowly, quietly, settling into the spaces between each step, each breath, until Elena could no longer deny what her instincts had already begun to accept, that this connection was not fleeting, not imagined, but something real that existed beyond the fragile rules she had lived by. And as the music carried them into another turn, she felt the last of her hesitation loosen its hold, replaced by a steady awareness that she was no longer standing at the edge of this moment. She was within it. King Adrian's gaze never left hers, and there was no uncertainty in it now, no question, only a calm certainty that seemed to anchor everything around them. And when he guided her closer, not abruptly, but with a quiet intention that left no room for misunderstanding, the space between them felt charged with something deeper than the dance itself, something that made the world beyond them seem distant and unimportant. "They will not understand," he said softly, his voice low enough to remain theirs alone, and Elena knew he was not speaking of the dance, not speaking of the moment, but of what lay beneath it, the truth that had begun to surface between them, and she felt a flicker of unease at that, not fear of him, but of everything that would come with being seen in this way, chosen in this way, in a world that had never allowed her such a place. Her gaze shifted briefly, just enough to take in the edges of the room again, and what she saw there was no longer the casual cruelty she had known before. It was something sharper, more calculated, the nobles watching with expressions that ranged from disbelief to quiet disapproval, their silence no longer passive but heavy with judgment, as if they were already deciding what this moment meant for the balance they had always controlled. Elena felt it press against her again, the old instinct to step back, to withdraw before she became a problem, before she became something they would seek to correct, and for a heartbeat her steps slowed, her focus wavering as the weight of that realization settled in. But King Adrian noticed immediately, his hand tightening just slightly at hers, grounding her once more before she could retreat into that familiar pattern. "Stay with me," he murmured, not as an order, but as a promise. And there was something in the way he said it that stilled the doubt before it could fully take shape. Something that told her she was not alone in this shift, that whatever came next would not be something she had to face by herself. The music swelled again, rising higher, fuller, as if the moment demanded it, and Elena allowed herself to follow, to trust the rhythm and the steady presence beside her. Even as the world beyond them grew more uncertain, her movements grew stronger, more assured, not because the fear had vanished, but because something else had taken its place, something that held greater weight than the expectations of the room, something that felt like truth rather than illusion. The distance between what she had been and what she was becoming widened with every step, and she could feel it in the way the room reacted, in the way no one stepped forward to interrupt, in the way even the most confident among them hesitated, because this was no longer a moment they could easily dismiss or control. And as the music reached its peak, as the final notes began to gather for their inevitable end, Elena realized that the true change had already happened, not in the way they danced, not in the way the room watched, but in the quiet certainty now rooted within her, that she could no longer return to being unseen, that something had awakened in this moment that would not allow her to disappear again, no matter what waited when the music finally stopped. The final note did not end the moment. It revealed it, stretching into the air like a held breath that no one dared release. And Elena felt it linger in the space between them as their movement slowed, as the rhythm that had carried them began to fade into silence, leaving behind something far more powerful than the music itself. King Adrian did not step away immediately, did not release her hand as tradition might have required. Instead, he held the stillness with the same quiet certainty he had carried through every step, his gaze steady on hers as if the end of the dance was not an ending at all, but a beginning neither of them intended to ignore. Around them, the hall remained frozen, the nobles watching with expressions they could no longer hide, disbelief etched into some, unease into others, and beneath it all a growing awareness that something irreversible had just taken place in front of them all. Elena felt the weight of it return, not as the crushing force it had once been, but as a reality she could now face without shrinking, because the fear that had once defined her had been replaced by something steadier, something that did not vanish when the music stopped, and she realized that the silence was no longer waiting for her to fail. It was waiting for him to speak. His hand shifted slightly in hers, a small movement that grounded her before he turned just enough for his voice to carry beyond the space they shared, not raised, not forceful, but clear in a way that commanded attention without effort. "This dance is not a courtesy," he said, and the words settled over the room with a weight that left no room for misinterpretation. "It is a choice." And the simplicity of it only made the meaning stronger, sharper, impossible to dismiss as a passing whim. A ripple moved through the crowd then, quiet but undeniable, the kind of reaction that could not be contained because it spoke to something deeper than expectation, and Elena felt it without needing to look. The shift in understanding, the realization that what they had witnessed was not a mistake, not a moment of misplaced attention, but something deliberate, something claimed. Her breath caught again, not from uncertainty this time, but from the clarity of what those words meant, and she found herself looking at him not with hesitation, but with a growing steadiness that mirrored his own, because for the first time she was not questioning whether she belonged in this moment. She was beginning to accept that she did. King Adrian's gaze softened just slightly as it returned fully to her, and in that quiet exchange, separate from the watching eyes, he spoke once more, his voice low, meant only for her. "I have been searching for what others overlooked," and the words carried no judgment, only truth, a truth that settled into her with a warmth that felt both new and deeply familiar. Elena felt something shift completely then, not a spark, not a flicker, but a steady flame that would not fade when the night ended. And she understood that whatever came next would not return her to the shadows she had once known, because something within her had already changed too much to allow it. The silence broke slowly after that, not with laughter, not with dismissal, but with a quiet, uncertain movement as the room adjusted to a reality it had not expected, and Elena